And here we are. After my mouth just made the weirdest noise ever when I pressed record. There, I didn't know where that came from. But
here we are.
I am
good
here
way to start
with Mr. Farina. Hello, good sir. And anyone who is watching on YouTube, you can see in the background that he's got a fancy graphic which shows exactly what we're promoting today. Here's my notes today, okay? And with Tony, because I know we always talk about everything, here's my notes.
Nice,
nothing
blank.
at all.
Doesn't matter.
Apart from at the very, very top, what I wrote, the publisher of your book. So we'll use that as a jumping off point. I'm sure I've gone many, many tangents, but we want to focus on you because you are a vessel of positivity in the world, in the podcasting realm, in the general world. Everyone who meets you, you're one of their favorite people, and you're just an absolute delight. And so when it was confirmed that you got a publishing deal, myself and everyone in Comics in Motion and all of us were all like, it could not have happened to a better person, because it's just someone who puts out so much good energy and is so enthusiastic and is such a talented writer and is so passionate about reading. It was one of those things where, I'm not a religious person, but moments like hearing that you got published, I was like, if there was a God, that's a pretty convincing, positive, karma element of things, which I was just like, it's such a nice thing. So, Tony, tell us about your book. Tell us, what's it called? Even though people should be able to see it on YouTube, but listeners and all that jazz.
It's called Welcome to Mansfield. So, of course, everybody calls me Tony. Tony has done it again. But my name is Anthony Russell Farina, and I've always thought, because, as a kid, J.D. Salinger was one of my favorite writers. Still is. And so I just always liked the initial thing. I was just thought, then you could be a little more ambiguous. That's part of why J.K. Rowling did it, right? Because she was hiding that she was Joanne Rowling, whatever. And so it was never about hiding anything. I'm just still Tony. I still sign everything Tony. But, as somebody who has a name that nobody calls you, Mike, it's just one of those things that I always wanted to do. So that is always in my mind. That would always be my
and your website
author name.
is
and my website, arfarina.com. Well, I set that up. So I set that up as part of my MFA program. Like one of the teachers there, Laura Pritchett, who's a novelist in her own right, very talented. She said in our marketing class, she was like, you got to get out there. So one of the assignments was set up something, give me a marketing. So I just made a free Weebly, and that's how it started. And it was super janky. And then I slowly made it a little better, and it was still pretty janky. And then once I got the book deal, Lee was like, poof, and then now it looks awesome. That was her. Everything was her. I set up the pages and I put some of the things are still in there. She's like, none of this just listing all the podcasts you've been on. So if you go to the podcast page, your logo is there, and Kyle's logo is there, and Spider Dan's logo, and Scott's logo, the logo, the Fem, when I did Femon with Jess, she was like, give me the logo. And so that's important to her to make it look pretty, which is good. She makes me look very good.
And I will say with your website, I remember before it got sort of redone and things. I just remember the main thing about it was I like big words and I cannot lie. And that I was like, even if the website isn't the prettiest, that being at the top is just hilarious. So I really like that element.
And that is actually the top. We've kept that as that's the top of my newsletter. That's kind of the name of my newsletter. So when you subscribe to my newsletter, the header, which of course she made too, was that. So that was me. And it was always because that's obviously from the Sir Mix-a-Lot song is where that comes from. But I always would sing that when that song came on. Was I like big words and I cannot lie? And then you could turn that into whatever you want about words. I love words. I always have. And so anyway, my book, that's what you asked. So it was a long-winded question. My book is called Welcome to Mansfield, Mike. And it was done here. The weird thing about writing books, and I know you've had other writers on here who talk about this, and Frank's a little different because he knows he's getting his published because he's got his own publishing. He's doing it all himself. Mm-hmm. But most writers, you write to do it. You write in a vacuum. And you're just sitting there and you're just banging it out. And so I wrote my master's thesis, which is a different book. It's called The Will. That one is very salty. And again, we said we would talk about the swearing. We'll get to that in a second. So that was a very salty book for adults. It's not an adult book. It's not like erotica, which again, nothing wrong with that. My publisher publishes a lot of that. That's fine. But it's just a very adult book about adult things. And it was experimental because it was for my MFA program. So there's 7 different characters and they all write in first person present tense. And the story is in real time over 7 days. So the first you meet with this person and it says this person's name at the top. And then that person is speaking in first person present tense. And then it'll switch to the different character and that character's name. And then that character's picking up in real time. So you never go backward, except for when the mom, who's dead, you hear from her. That's obviously in the past because she's dead. There's forms of letters and stuff like that. They may talk about the past, but it's always in real time moving forward. So I had 7 different voices, first person voices, and it was a crazy experience. It was fun. And that book is still not sold, shockingly. But I'm proud of that book. I really like it. I worked really hard on it. But that was my master's thesis. And so then it was like, well, what am I going to do next? And I had a couple of other ideas. And this book, Mansfield Park, is the Jane Austen book that people don't like. I mean, not everybody. I know you recently listened to Sense and Sensibility, which is great because the full cast is the way to go. But this one is her longest, most dense book. It's the only book where you follow the heroine from her being a little kid until adulthood. None of the other books follow anybody. And it was just kind of misunderstood. And so one of my last critical papers, like when you're getting an MFA, which is a Master of Fine Arts is what it stands for. When you're getting that, you have to write a lot of critical stuff as well as the fiction stuff. And so I was doing this deep dive into character. And so I was like, I'm going to think about, and of course, her name in the book is really Fanny Price, which I learned from you and Megan what Fanny means in England.
Yeah, not the same. In America, it's butt.
In America, it's a butt.
But over here, it's the women's front butt. So
it's front butt. I think we're adults, so we could say vagina. I think we could say that.
I just like saying front butt. It just
front
cracks
butt
me up.
is so fun. I love that. That's what it is now. It's the British front. But anyway, when Jane wrote the book, obviously it wasn't that. Fanny just was short for Frances, and her mom is Frances. It was a nickname, and her mom, and in the book Mansfield Park, the mom is called Frances Price, and her daughter is called Frances Price, so they call her Fanny. So in fiction, and when you hear like in Sense and Sensibility, John Dashwood's wife is called Fanny because her mom her real name is Frances.
Oh, I did not know Fanny was an abbreviation of Francis. I would not guess that.
No,
there's a lot of weird
not.
things, like Dick being a short version of Richard. It's like, who?
Yeah, and
where did these come from?
Peggy for Margaret.
Is that what that is? Oh my lord! Wow, I always thought Maggie because obviously we're with the Royals. Where we had with the Royals Margaret, their nickname Maggie. So I've never. Wow.
Yeah, and in the next book that I'm writing in the series, actually, her name is Maggie because it's Margaret Dashwood's perspective of that story. So, but. Yeah, so nicknames are weird. So anyway, so I was doing this character sketch of Fanny Price, and I just was like, she's so misunderstood, and everybody thinks she's boring and whatever. And to be fair, the book ends, spoiler alert for a 200-year-old book, Mansfield Park ends with her marrying her first cousin. So that's not great. And I was like, okay, well, if you're going to redo that, if you're going to spend some time in Jane Austen's world, you can't do that. It can't end with that. So that's not great. But I thought it would be fun. So the next project I wanted to do when I finished my thing was just like, okay, so the MFA, the will, I was writing it for my thesis. So it was an assignment. I had to turn in things I had to grade. I had to do it to get my degree. And so then what are you going to do next? And I was like, well, let me take a look at Mansfield Park. I just spent some time there for a paper I was writing for the critical piece. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do that and just see what I can do. So I just started writing this book. And I thought, well, what if I reframe Mansfield Park and we don't tell her whole life story. We just focus on this little bit of her time. And initially I thought it was going to take place over 4 years, like her in college, university, as you guys would say, right after high school. And so I was like, okay, let's do that. So I started writing it, and that's not what it became. It actually takes place only over a few months, but it's still a really good coming of age story. And so I just started. And as I was writing it, I was like, okay, I'm not calling her Fanny. I'll call her Junior. Like, I decided that she's a Southerner, and so they would call her Junior, and so Junior Price is her name, and the rest of the story is kind of, this beginning structure is very similar to the Mansfield Park book. And as I was writing it, I just thought, it'd be fun to like have all these fun Easter eggs for the other Austen books, and I just did that as a cheeky little thing, and then I was querying it. We'll come back. I'll tell a little bit more, but we were querying it. And then through our friend Tanya Todd, she was like, check out this publisher for this other project we were doing. And I was like, oh, it's too bad they only want to do series because I don't really have a series. And so I queried this at a different place, a different publisher who I didn't need an agent for. And they wrote me back and they said they were interested. But they were waiting. And so in the meantime, one day, Lee and I were sitting there, and it's like, I already wrote all the other characters into this. So what if I just put it all in a shared universe? And so like first book is the retelling of Mansfield Park, but interestingly enough, like Fanny Price is kind of a background character in her own novel. Like in any other novel, she's not the main character because she's boring and people don't like her. Like the good girl is never the star, right? It's always the salty girl. And there's a lot of those girls in Mansfield Park. But so all the other characters that I put in there were like the forgotten characters in the novels, but they're side characters. And so I was like, oh, well, what if I just did that? And then the second book would retell Sense and Sensibility, but from Margaret Dashwood's perspective, or retell Pride and Prejudice through Mary Bennett's perspective, or Emma through Jane Fairfax. So these are the characters I put in. So I pitched it to my publisher. They're called Four Horsemen Publications. I did not know they were a Florida-based publisher when I submitted because of the internet. And I submitted, and it was like a couple of weeks, maybe a month later, they sent the thing and were like, let's talk. We're interested. And it was so cool. And so the person, I want to make sure I thank her for this. I didn't realize how intricate she was into making this happen. So one of the people who works at Four Horsemen, she's called Bo Lake. She's a writer in her own. We'll show note her. I'll send you her link. We'll show note Bo Lake's stuff. She's a writer too. But she's the one who read it and was like, oh, I dig this. This is what I want. And so she reached out to one of the editors there, who's a big Janeite, and is like, this is something we should do. And it's slightly different from everything else because it's not like hardcore romance. It's not, there's no sexy time or anything. And it's not science fiction. That's mostly what Four Horsemen does. But they were like, they took a chance. They loved the idea. It's a series, but it's not like a traditional series where it's like cliffhanger, and they said yes. And so then I wrote that other company and said, sorry, thanks for, I know you're still considering me, but I've got a publication offer, and then moved on with my life. And then 2 weeks later, I got an email from that place, from the other publisher. Somehow the person who was supposed to get that email didn't work there anymore. So they never got the one. They offered me a book deal too. So I two different companies wanted this book. So that makes me feel very good.
Very good.
That's the long story of how I got there. So I wrote a book just for fun for me. The thought being, I love Jane Austen.
Do you?
There's lots.
Really?
I do.
I never heard about that. Is there any sort of hint in each of the rooms in your house that would give people an indication?
I don't know that would give anything away. There's the Jane Austen action figure in this room. So she, but anyway, so it's just like, there's so many. And as I discovered just today, one of your favorite writers and former guest on Genuine Chit-Chat and Star Wars Comics and Canon, Claudia Gray, writes Jane Austen books. She has Jane Austen murder mysteries,
which is incredible.
Which is hers are the children of the characters from the 6 books solve crimes together. And it's funny because she makes them all in a connected universe too. So she thought the same thing. Is like, wouldn't it be cool if these people, and I didn't know until today. That's pretty cool. I'm in good company. So anyway, so that was it. And so I just thought it would be fun. And so now I went from writing a book just for me, just in a room, hoping someone would pick it up, to I've got 5 more books to write. So I sold all 6.
You did. So I was going to ask about that. So you're doing an adaptation, but am I right in thinking, although the Jane Austen novels, they're all individual, was Mansfield Park, that wasn't her first, was it?
No, it was one of the last ones published.
That's what I thought. So what's the I'm trying to think, because with Jane Austen, it's like, she's got the 6 books. Isn't one of them, was it kind of unfinished? Was it Persuasion?
No, that's the 7th book, Sanditon.
Oh, okay.
And then there are 2 books that she wrote first. One is called Love and Friendship, which was like letters. It's an epistolary novel. And they made a movie not that long ago with Kate Beckinsale. It was actually pretty good. And then there's one called The Watsons. And that's kind of just sort of the inspiration for Emma, the novel Emma. There's a character called Emma in that who is the main character there too. She uses a lot of the same names. But so those 2 she wrote as a kid, The Watsons and Love and Friendship. And then Sanditon she didn't finish. And I've read Sanditon, and it is just notes. The first few chapters are really good, and then it filters off, and they hired a different woman to write it. And it's actually just called Jane Austen and a Lady, because when Jane Austen published, it wasn't under her name because women weren't allowed to know who they were.
Right.
So it was just a lady. So that was Jane Austen and another lady, I think is what it was. And it's not great. It isn't fully realized, but the BBC or ITV and the PBS in America actually did a TV adaptation of Sanditon recently. And that was actually, I think, a great finish of the series. Like, they gave it the life that the book couldn't give it.
And what is it about Jane Austen that you love so much? Like, I know you've told me personally before, because I knew as someone who's British, and I've now, inspired by you, I've been to her house. Well, there's a place nearby me where she lived for a while, but her main house is only like, I think it's an hour away. So me and Megan just one morning on the weekend, we're like, why don't we just go to Jane Austen's house? So we just went there and obviously sent you.
And you sent us one of those little books that Lee has sitting on her desk.
Yeah. Definitely. So, like, what is it about Jane Austen that has struck a chord with you as a reader, as an author? When did you first read Jane Austen? Because obviously, doing a YA modern day adaptation shared universe of Jane Austen, you wouldn't be able to do that unless you were really into Jane Austen. So, what? And obviously, you said you wrote this book kind of for yourself, and then just hopefully someone pick it up, but it's more for you. What is it about Jane Austen that connects with you so much?
Well, so to be fair, and so when I was younger, I was a big reader, obviously. Read my whole life. I read the Chronicles of Narnia in kindergarten, which is when I was 5. I was just a reader. It's what I love to do. And these books came along. My mom would just be like, hey, read a book. Here's a book. Here's a book. She didn't really care about age appropriateness. It was just like a book to keep me quiet. Shut up and read this book. And so that worked a lot. But there's this theory that there's 3 really good Jane Austen books and 3 that are just meh. And so the 3 that are really good, I believed the hype train. And they were just probably the 3 that my mother had around the house. Because I know she didn't have all 6 of them around the house. So it was Pride and Prejudice, which is the one everybody knows best, Sense and Sensibility, and Emma are the 3. So those are the 3. I'd read those, like in high school, and liked them all. And I always thought Emma was hysterical. And then when Clueless happened, which is the greatest adaptation of Jane Austen in the history of ever, and Clueless totally captured the funniness and the silliness of Emma. And so what I always liked about Jane Austen is a couple of things. The stories are always, the movies and the TV shows always make them seem like they're about love, but they're really about class. And as somebody who, and I've said this before, I didn't know I was poor until I went to college. Like, how you don't know your situation. You don't know what your life is like until you leave home. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't know, like, we were just working class. Like, I didn't know what it was like. And then it wasn't like, and I wouldn't have thought, even in my little hometown, no one would probably think we're poor because that's how everybody's life is. But then you go to like this university, it's called Albion College in Michigan. And like kids were like writing checks to go there. Like their dads were just like, because there were some dumb people there. Like, and we're like, I know how hard it was to get in here. How did you get here? And I remember one time having that conversation with a friend of mine. Dell and I were sitting there talking to some kid. He was really dumb and we were trying to help him with something. And Dell was really blunt. And he was just like, I don't know how you got in here. He's like, how are you here? And the kid said, my dad went here. He wrote a check. And that makes me a little sad because I feel like I got that great education. And this kid did not graduate. So writing the check will get you in, but it won't get you out, that kind of thing. So it's that kind of college. But anyway, so Jane Austen was always writing about that. All of her main characters are not, except for Emma, are not well-to-do. They either were well-to-do and they've fallen on hard times, or they're just like middle class. Like the Bennets are farmers, right? That's the whole thing at the end of Pride and Prejudice. Spoiler alert. Sorry, everybody. The end of Pride and Prejudice, when Darcy's auntie comes, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and yells at Lizzie and saying, like, how dare you steal my husband away from his first cousin who he was supposed to marry, which is true. And she's like, I didn't do anything. He just likes me. And she's like, you're nobody. You come from nobody. And she's like, but my father's a gentleman, but he's a farmer. So it's not good enough. You know what I mean? Because it's not like that Mr. Bennet was out digging weeds, but he owned a farm and he ran a farm and they were goats and they all had cow shit on their feet. You know what I mean? Like, so that class thing in all of the books is always there. And in Emma, even though Emma is rich, she's really interested in the people in town. Like she's got her nose in everybody's business. So that's why Clueless does such a good job. It's like, you got to help those we got to help people. And so she wants to help Harriet and she wants to give her time and money and just be useful. And she thinks, but it's still like she doesn't understand. Like she thinks I'm rich. And so just me showing up and giving you something must be good enough. And she really doesn't get it. And that's what makes it really funny. So in addition to it being this really interesting conversation about class, it's also making fun of the thing that it is. So it was like Deadpool before Deadpool, right? It's very satirical. She's making fun of romance books while being a romance book. She's making fun of the the rich and hoity-toity while writing about being them. And so I just thought that's subversive as fuck, and I loved it. So that was it. So it's just, I think she's funny, and she's dry. She's very dry. And again, the way that all of the adaptations always push the love and romance. So people think, is this a kissing book?
Mm.
And it is, but it's also making fun of kissing books. It's both things. And I just think that's super talented. And she can construct a sentence like nobody. There's very few writers who are as good at sentence structure as she is. And she knows how to write a run-on sentence grammatically. Like, it's not a run-on sentence. She knows how to write a long sentence with the right punctuation so that it's not a run-on. And you follow it. You're like, wow, there's 50 words in that sentence, and it didn't annoy me. Whereas like you read Melville or you read like William Faulkner, and you're like, oh my God, there's 50 words in that sentence, and I want you to stab me in the face. So there was just something about her skill, her wit. And so that's how I got into her. And so then for years, it was just those books over and over. I read Emma. I used to teach Emma to my English literature students. They didn't love it, which upset me. And then when Leah and I got together, and she was the same thing. Read these, whatever. And we just started talking about books we hadn't read, and everybody's got blind spots. And so we realized we hadn't read the other three. And so then we did, like, together in what Kieran calls, one of our kids, Kieran, calls us the world's smallest book club. And then once I realized the other three, Persuasion, Northanger Abbey, and Mansfield Park, it's like, wow, those are actually great. Actually, and I fell in love. Persuasion is still my favorite, but Mansfield Park was a masterpiece, I thought, and misunderstood. And I just was mad at myself for all the years I didn't read them. I could have been out there, so it wasn't until adulthood, but then I've reread them all a million times, not a million times, but I've read them all at least 5 times since then in the last, 18 years. And it's like comfort. It's comfort. How you got comfort food, or, it's like putting on, episode 3 for you, right? Like you can just be like,
all of Star Wars is comfort for me. That's how I escape the world. It's like, it's one of those things whenever I consume Star Wars content, it's like there are other books to read. It's like, yes, but I haven't read all the Star Wars ones yet.
Yes, and I sent you the Timothy Zahn original.
You did, and
Franz.
I'm so thankful for that, because I basically had to whinge at Amazon because they really annoyed me, because I've got Audible and they recommended me Heir to the Empire unabridged, and I was like, finally, because I listen to most Legend stuff in audiobook, and I read most High Republic stuff physically, and Star Wars-y stuff I listen to audiobook-wise, and they recommended me Heir to the Empire, and I was like, oh, it's there, and I click on it, and it goes, not available in this region. I was like, you know what, Amazon? Fuck you. So I wrote to them and I was like, hey, this really bothered me because I've been waiting for this to come out for ages. And they kept ignoring me for some reason. I wasn't like shitty in my email or anything. And then I sent another one the other day and they're like, really sorry, we didn't get the other ones. Really, really sorry. Here's a free Amazon credit. And I was like,
whoa.
Okay. Well, I was like, well, I got a free book out of it, but I was just like,
and I sent them to you.
You did. Yeah, exactly. And I'm just like, it's the lesson. This is what things, it bothers me so much about people is like with big publishers and stuff. It's like, we're not going to let it happen in this country. It's like, well, everyone's going to get it. You're just not going to make any money from it. You do realize when Game of Thrones first came out and it was coming out like weeks before in America than anywhere else, it became the most pirated show on television.
Of course.
As soon as they aired it everywhere in the world at the same time, the piracy rate completely dropped because people actually, I want to pay for the audiobook version of Heir to the Empire. Disney, Lucasfilm, Penguin, Random House Publishing, whoever it is, they won't allow it, so I have to get it from someone else. So I'm out of interest.
It's crazy. I don't understand it. It is really frustrating, though.
Especially with Disney at the helm, who's like the biggest company in the universe.
You've got the money. Yeah. Sell it. Well, but I wonder, the only thing I can think of is because that was but Timothy Zahn's writing for them. He's in canon now. So it's not like they haven't worked out a deal.
But also, they've been recently doing the Essentials Legends collection, which they've been re-releasing, which I've got 3 of them here, which the Heir to the Empire trilogy was among the first ones. I can buy the new cover, new, nicely done Essential Legends collection of Heir to the Empire. All the audiobooks are being re-released as Essential Legends collections. A couple of them are being re-recorded. The Darth Maul one was recorded by Sam Witwer, who voices Maul in the animated series. But Heir to the Empire is the only one, the only Legends thing that you cannot get. You can even get these on Audible in the UK. You can get these really weird offshoot Legends books that aren't even Essential Legends, that are only like 3 hours long in audiobook form, read by just some random person who's not like, mainly Jonathan Davis or Mark Thompson were the main ones. And you're just like, so I can listen to MedStar 1 which is like a small book about like a random offshoot character, Barriss Offee, and it's not a very popular book. It's well regarded. It's just not a lot of people read it. I can listen to that, but Heir to the Empire is among the only. The biggest Legends books that exist that basically
in the world.
kickstarted
I read them when they came out.
That's what I mean. Like, I've never read it because I'm like, it baffled me. But I want to ask you actually about Jane Austen and stuff, because obviously I listened to Sense and Sensibility because on Audible, if you get an Audible subscription, you get free access to quite a lot of stuff. There's a lot of Bill Bryson books and things on there. But you've got the 6 Jane Austen novels, and they're all read by a full voice cast. You've got like Emma Thompson and Billie Piper and loads of other cool people who are characters in a lot of them. And so I will get through them all. But with that kind of in mind, have you listened to some of the audio productions of Jane Austen as well? Or have you been, not in a dicky way, but have you been a purist and have you only read Jane Austen ones?
Oh, no, both. I listened to them a lot. The original audio ones I listened to were by this woman called Flo Gibson. And these were old, like when it was still called Books on Tape, the company. And the company is still called Books on Tape, believe it or not. But they don't do as much. But yeah, so no, the Flo Gibson one, she read them all, and she sounds very like a school marm. But she was good, but the quality wasn't great. I have not listened to the full cast ones because I don't have Audible, and those are Audible only, Audible exclusive. But Juliet Stevenson's, she's an amazing reader. She has done some. There's a couple more. The woman, and I can't think of her name right now, so people are going to yell at me. She played Mrs. Bennet in one version of Pride and Prejudice. I don't even remember, but she did an audio version of Pride and Prejudice too. So I thought that was pretty clever. So they like try to do things like that. The person I would want, the dream, I'll throw this out in the universe, is there's a British book narrator. She's called Fiona Hardingham. And she is my favorite narrator in the history of the world. And I would love for her to do the Austen books. Because her accent range is unbelievable. Like, she and January Lavoie, and January did, January.
But yeah, funnily enough, this book here, which made people might be able to see, Last Shot by Daniel Jose Older.
Right.
3 people who do the audiobook, which is the author, Daniel Jose Older, Mark Thompson, and January Lavoie.
You know her. Yeah. She did.
She's done loads of stuff.
She's doing the Afro books.
Yes. Yeah.
She's amazing. There's just like a handful of people. Like, she did the entire Diviner series, this fantasy book series by Libba Bray. And I didn't know, like, halfway through the first book I was listening to it, I forgot that it was not a full cast. She's that good. Like, she's a classically trained stage actor. But anyway, but Fiona Hardingham is an amazing reader. Like, she did, there's a writer called Chuck Klosterman. He does essays, like snarky little essays. And he had a book of philosophy called But What If We're Wrong? And he reads the introduction of the audiobook, and then he's like, no, I'm going to turn it over to Fiona Hardingham because I always sound better when I'm a British woman. And then she reads the rest of the book as him, though. So she doesn't like say Chuck, she says I, but so it's great.
That's amazing.
So, and then in his most recent book, he did that with Deanne Graham. So I'm a big audiobook junkie. I'd say I'm like half and half audiobooks and book books because I read a lot of comic books, obviously graphic novels. And so those are the ones I read. And then, and there's like a book right now I'm reading. It's called Please Kill Me. It's the history of punk rock. And so that's a book, like it's a tome, and there's pictures and stuff in there. And like with the Beastie Boys book, like you want that because there's pictures. But so if it's like, I mean, the last time I sat down and read Mansfield Park was when it was maybe like 4 years ago, when I was doing the thing for class. But before I started writing this, I listened to it again. And then, so for Sense and Sensibility, because that's the new one I'm working on, I actually had the book sitting here next to me for the longest time to like reference. But then I listened to that one too, the Juliet Stevenson one. So I don't care. Give me Jane Austen, however you want to give it to me. I'm here for it. Like when the new movies come out, that new Emma came out with Anya Taylor-Joy. Watch that. I'm here. Whatever.
That's on my to watch list. I do want to watch.
It's very good. It's on Freevee now. I think you can get it like. You don't even have to pay for it. Yeah.
I think over here, funny enough, Freevee, I only know about that because we've been watching Gordon Ramsay's Hell's Kitchen, and because Megan loves Gordon Ramsay and stuff, and I don't mind him, but I haven't got the spark for cooking like Megan does. So we watch a lot of my crazy nerdy stuff, and then for Megan we watch Bake Off, Drag Race, those sort of things. Yeah. And then she's like, "Oh, we should watch Hell's Kitchen because you've only seen bits and pieces, the memes online. You're an idiot sandwich, things like that." And I was like, "Okay," so I just found it on Amazon, but it's on Freevee.
Yeah,
and we started from series
which is
1.
their free channel. Yeah,
yeah, and we were like, I was like, oh, she was like, I'll just put one of them on. I was like, okay, I guess series 1. She was like, you started from series 1. I was like, I thought you wanted to watch Hell's Kitchen. She was like, but series 1 was ages ago, and it's Freevee, so that's tangent of how I know about that. But with the Jane Austen books, obviously the books are, as you said, like hundreds of years old. When you to make an adaptation, obviously you're making like a young adult adaptation, but really Jane Austen's novels, they're not explicit or anything. So it's hard, like the term, I'm sure you will come across this, and you've probably already come across this, the YA kind of genre. I know from when I spoke to Claudia Gray and things, it's got a little bit of baggage, mainly from middle-aged white dudes who think, oh, it's for young adult, it's teen stuff, it's like teen pop. So I'm like, I'm not going to listen to that, when actually YA, including Star Wars, has some of the best, stories in there. So how would you class what demographic, in air quotes, would in a modern day is Jane Austen aimed towards? Is it an adult? And if so, how do you translate that in a writing style to a YA vague demographic without, isolating non-YAs, if you know what I'm saying?
Sure. So at the time when she wrote it, it was for adults because except for Kat, and again, Fanny, because we watch her grow up the whole time. So she's like 5 or 6 when the book starts. But most of them are already in their 20s. Like Lizzie Bennet's 21, Emma's 21. I guess Marianne is 19 and Eleanor is 16. No, Eleanor's 16 and Marianne is 19. Sorry, scrap. Eleanor's 19, Marianne is 16. In Persuasion, which is my favorite, Anne Elliott's in her 20s. Oh my goodness, one foot in the grave. It's true, though. It is. It's very true. Like, what a shock. Oh, no.
Well, back then especially, because,
Oh, yeah. In Northanger Abbey, Kat is probably a teenager still. Kat Marlin. She's great. Kat Marlin is such an amazing, fascinating character, and I can't wait to write her book. I'm really excited. But so it was at the time they were adults because they were out. So the term out, all phrases mean everything. So back then, if a girl was out, she wasn't gay. She was available to be married. And so in Pride and Prejudice, Lizzie's 21, Jane is 22, 23, Mary's 18, Kitty's 16, Lydia's 15. Yeah. And so there's a scene when Lizzie's meeting Lady Catherine de Bourgh and she's saying about, are you, and how many of your sisters are out? And she's like, they're all out. And it was like, oh, gasp, like you're out before all of them are out before the oldest are married. And it's this whole bullshit. And that's kind of, like what Taming of the Shrew is about. I know you're not a big Shakespeare fan, but that's kind of the whole thing. The younger sister can't get married till the older sister does. And, she's a bitch, and so nobody wants to marry her. She's a shrew, whatever. But Kate, for 3/4 of that book, play as my favorite character in Shakespeare. And then the final one bugs me a lot. But anyway, so that's just kind of how it was done. And so at the time, they were adults, even though they were teenagers or young women. But like Jane Austen's very specifically focusing on women because women had no agency, and that was the whole point. And so what was the whole goal is that women were being forced into marriage essentially, and some of them desperately want to get married, like Kitty and Lydia. Some of them think it's absurd, like Mary Bennet and Emma. Emma from Emma, go figure. And like even Eleanor in Sense and Sensibility is not that interested. She almost like backs into falling in love with Edward because she's kind of like, we're both the same. We're both painful. Like, I debated with myself, and I didn't ultimately do this, but I debated with myself to have both Eleanor and Edward in my version be on the spectrum. Like just name it. Because I feel like when you read that book, they both are. They're both very painfully shy, and they're very awkward, and they don't understand social cues and all those things. And, so they were but they're both good people, and they find each other, and you're so happy for them. Like, I love that Eleanor and Edward get together. So I think people then, that was an adult. In today's parlance of naming books and where they go and categorizing books, they'd be called new adult. And so that's a new thing. So when I used to teach young adult literature years ago, young adult essentially meant 12 to 22.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah.
So that was all the way through college. I figured in America, you're graduating college. If you're a traditional college student, you're graduating about 21, 22. Right?
Yeah, not dissimilar from here as well.
Yeah. So that's when most people graduate uni around then. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Because yours is because you do the 2 years of college and then 3 years of uni.
Yeah,
And
most
we do
people.
4 years of high school and 4 years of
Because
university.
college, it's like you finish school at like 16-ish, and then you go into college for 2 years till you're 18-ish, and then you go into university if you don't have a gap year for normally 3 years, but sometimes 4, unless you're going to, being like a doctor or something like that. But generally, so early 20s is normally, by the time you're in your early 20s in the UK, you're either finishing education, finishing an apprenticeship, or you've been working.
You've been working because you've finished. Exactly. And so so everybody's hitting adulthood around that time. So there's this new. So what they realize is that such a big gap, like 12 to 22. Come on, you're not even the same person, let alone have the same. So they've tried to rename some things. So there's children's literature, and then now there's like middle readers, which is more like 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade in America, which is like 10, 11, 12.
Yeah.
And then they do tween. So that's like 11, 12, 13-year-olds. And then so like young adult is generally you're in high school, and then new adult is when you're like in college or just like in your early 20s. So it's kind of new adult is from maybe 18 to 25. Young adult is now from like 13 to 19, and then tween and / middle reader, and then children. So it's like, that's how they've kind of reclassified things.
Yeah, because with me, my point of reference is mainly the Star Wars books, because in the High Republic, every wave they release 3 books. They release a middle grade, a young adult, and an air quotes adult book. And I've read all of them. And to be fair, the middle grade books, some of them are phenomenal. Like, they're still so well written and so amazing. And I was like, I'll pick this up because I'm a completionist. And I read them. I was like, these are really well written, clever stories that they're just appropriate language wise and thematically. That, you're not having a graphic description of someone becoming a stoned husk and the last breath coming out and them collapsing into stone. It's a bit, just rein it back a little
dialed back. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the only real difference with it. So that's how I've been the point of reference.
And I actually just finished a middle reader book today that broke me. I cried.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
It's so good. Oh, yeah. David Levithan, who's one of the best American writers and best, writers in general. It was great. I think some of my all-time favorite books are middle reader books. Like, I still love the Narnia books. Whatever you want to say about all of the religious overtones, those are there. I mean, those are middle reader books, and I read them as a young person.
Some of the first books I owned. I remember specifically having the classic, and it's Prince Caspian. It's not. Is Prince Caspian the first one? It's not.
No. Well, the first one was Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe in the original publication, and then The Magician's Nephew was the.
That was it, The Magician's Nephew, because I had the 7 collection, 6 or 7.
Yeah. And when he republished them, and he because when I read them, Magician's Nephew was the middle book, so you just had to believe in Narnia for 3 books.
Wow. Okay.
And then he finally explained to you what Narnia was, and then he give you 3 books after. That was never a problem for me. And then he wanted to read once they were all published. Lewis republished them with The Magician's Nephew first.
I see. Yeah, because I remember, especially when the films came out, I read the books. Yeah, and I was like, they start with Lion Witch, and I was like, okay, that's weird.
That's how the original publication was.
Yeah, and then they did Prince Cat. There's 3 films I seem to recall, and they're in a weird order.
They skipped Horse and His Boy.
Yeah, and I was like, I remember being like, I'm not a Narnia fanatic, and I can only very peripherally remember them, but I remember they were among the first books that I read when I was younger, because my brother had them, and he gave them to me, and I read Magician's Nephew.
Good brother.
I was like, this is quite cool. I remember there's a scene in, I think it's Magician's Nephew, where there's just a lot of stuff in a loft, and I think that's how they get into Narnia. And
it's always a different way. Yeah. Sometimes it's like a door on the wall. Yeah.
Yeah, because I knew vaguely about Lion Witch, and I was like, Magician's Nephew, that's quite a cool turn. And then I remember the films came out, and this is when I was a teenager, so I was being a purist dick for no reason. I was like, these films suck because they've done it the wrong order. It's like, but I can't even remember what the right order is. Like teenagers do, being angsty just for being angsty.
Just for the sake of that. Yeah, no, and that's very true. But yeah, so I think real Jane Austen, like Jane Austen, her books, I would classify them all as new adult, even though some of them are still teenagers, specifically Kat Norland. And this one, Mansfield, is a full coming of age because she's a little kid when it starts and she gets married at the end. So that one is like that. But mine, the way I adapted them into YA is I was like, okay, I'm going to make them all actual teenagers. Like I'm going to make them all, and I'm straddling it because I'm setting it like Mansfield in my book is a university, Mansfield College. And it's essentially based on my college. I mean, like everything about it, like a lot of the descriptions, the way the campus is set up, a lot of the things are the same just because it's what you know. You write what you know. That's what everybody tells you. And so I was like, well, I love being in college. I love education. I'm a college professor. Write a love letter to education and have a conversation about class. And so in my book series, Mansfield College is this really rich hoity-toity college, but knowing that everybody can't afford to go, there's at 5, it's like Wonka, every year 5 people around the world get a golden ticket and they get to go for free. But they have to pay room and board. The tuition is paid for. But you have to apply. It's not like you got to buy a Wonka bar or a Mansfield bar. You got to like jump through hoops. Whereas everybody else, if their grades are good and they can afford it, they can get in. First come, first serve. So however many seats there are, fill up like this because it's one of the most prestigious colleges in America. But 5 spots are open. And so in the very first one that I wrote, our main character, Junior, she wins one. And then so does Margaret Dashwood. And that was just a fun joke that I did. And then I wasn't planning on writing a whole series. So they become friends. And that was my first. And the president of their university is Mary Bennett, the middle sister from Pride and Prejudice. And her advisor is the guy who meets Kat Norland and takes her to Northanger Abbey and does all that. Dr. Allen is in it. And then Walt Elliot from Persuasion is in it, and she meets him, and then Jane Fairfax and Emma. So all these characters are there. They all go to this college. And so then I was like, once I started the series, I was like, okay, so all roads lead to Mansfield. So the first book is the first book. And then the second book that I'm working on now goes back 4 years. And we meet Maggie Dashwood on her 13th birthday, and we find out what leads her to Mansfield. And then the third book will go back 20 years to a young Mary Bennett and find out how she goes to Mansfield. She's the president of Mansfield College now. And so then books 5 and 6, or 4 and 5 will be right after. So Jane Fairfax will follow her after, and her whole drama with Emma. And then I'll do the Northanger Abbey one. And then the final one will be Persuasion, because that's when they're adults, right? So it'll be Walt's book, and that one will be almost exactly Persuasion. That'll be the only one where the main character was a man, where all the rest will still be girls. But his aunt, Anne, who is my favorite of the heroine, she's my favorite Jane Austen heroine, Anne Elliot, she'll be in there. So he'll be with her, and we'll kind of be reliving her life parallel to that. So that's the plan. So, but all roads go to Mansfield College, and that's going to be the crux of this series. And then if I want to, they've told me, my publishers, if I want to write more. And so I thought it might be fun occasionally to do like a version of Love and Friendship, which are the epistolary novels where they're just writing letters. So like as a catch-up, like if I wanted to, anytime I wanted to write Love and Friendship Volume 1, and if you wanted to know where the characters were, like little short novella sequels where the characters can write letters to each other, write emails to each other, because it's modern day, or text or whatever. I'm not there yet, but that's something I could do if I wished. But it's just fun. So what I chose to do is bring them all down, put them at college. So it does that gap between high school and college. And because this one, Maggie's 13, 14, 15, 16, it's true YA. And I made Junior young, like she graduated high school young. So she's still 16 going on 17 when she goes. That's right. And everybody can sing that if you want to. If you want to pause for a Sound of Music break, I am 16 going on 17. And so she's going to college. And so what I wanted to do, though, because I swear a lot, as Mike knows, I've sworn already on this podcast, but all of my other books have all the swear words in them. But as a way to honor Jane, and I decided to not do that. So all the swearing happens off page. Like they swear, people do stuff in this book. There's a pregnancy that happens. There's a teenage pregnancy in Mansfield, Welcome to Mansfield, but it all happens off screen. So while you're reading it, so there's even one line in the new book I'm writing where it's like, because it's not that kind of book, we'll just leave it here and you won't hear what Eleanor said. Like, because Eleanor's mad and she's swearing at somebody. And so we just kind of walk away from her. So I'm acknowledging that. And I'm sure Jane Austen swore like a sailor, but she didn't write it in her books because it wasn't appropriate. Yeah. So I thought to honor her. So the listing is tame. Like the categorization of my book is tame.
I'd say accessible.
Right, but that is the actual like when you go to like.
Oh, I see. I was just
to get the arc. It's like listed as tame.
Okay. Yeah, because there's no like explicit content in that sort of regard. Well, so do you do it in a sense of almost like so and so? Oh, she's yelling profanities or she's cursing, because like to compare it once again, because my main literary thing at the moment is obviously Star Wars,
of course.
And obviously in Star Wars they make up swear words, Carabas, Stangfarrick, that sort of thing. But there are times where it's like, so and so dropped this, and I heard them curse in their native tongue.
That's it.
So it's like you don't have to write, fucking big letters, but so that it's a clever way to write around it. Right, I see.
Yeah,
I see.
That's totally what I did, and so that is how I also am making it. So the Jane Austen purists won't read this and be like, "What's going on?" But then there'll also be some stuff. So like, there's gay characters, and there are 100% gay characters in the Austen novels, but they're not out. Like nobody knows. Or there's asexual characters, or there's bisexual characters, or there's, androgynous characters. And so because it's set in the modern day, just add them in there. But again, it's not explicit. It just is. These are just folks doing stuff. People get divorced. People have sex out of wedlock. People get drunk at a party. But it's not, because the things that Jane did, showing ankle, she was pretty risque. The things like her female character saying no to the men they were supposed to be betrothed to. Like in Pride and Prejudice, Lydia Bennet runs off. She's 15. She runs off with Wickham. They're clearly having sex. They're having a relationship. And then when they get caught, they get forced to get married. But they've been together for this whole, illicit weekend. So we know what's going on. And also Wickham's a creep. I mean, she's 15, dude. But back then, again, 15,
Yeah, well, I will say over here in the UK, the legal age for sex is 16. So I'm not condoning underage sex, to clarify, but to add extra context from the British perspective,
of course,
it's being fit. If you're a 15-year-old sleeping with a 16-year-old, it's still illegal, but it's not the same as in America.
Right?
There's a slightly different level, but
Wickham is in he's a soldier.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, he's not. Yeah.
I mean, you have to do some tweaking as well. Because I know you said I think it's Sense and Sensibility. One of the sisters gets with, I can't remember the names, but it's one of the main sisters gets with that really nice older chap.
Edward.
But he's
Brandon, Colonel Brandon.
That was it. And he was like, but he's like 10 or 15, 20 years older or something than.
He's 5 years older or 5 years younger than their mom.
That was it, yeah, because I was like, the age difference was quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I
16 and 35.
Yeah, because even in those times in that book, there's a mention of how she's like, he's way too old for me. And even in those days, that's like a really odd thing to say, because the age thing wasn't as much of a big deal. So how do you translate, the core, like when you do an adaptation of a book, if you're adapting Jane Austen to comics or a movie or things, there's certain things you have to adapt just because the medium is different and other things can come along with that more organically. How do you, in essence, not quite rewrite Austen, but how do you decide which elements you want to keep in the adaptation, and how do you decide what to change? Like how is this a Jane Austen adaptation and not you just writing stories with Jane Austen characters, if you see what I'm saying?
Sure, I hear what you're saying. So it needs to end the same way. Like, or at least you need to get close to there. The relationships, I feel, because you can't, the people need to end up with the people. Because the romance, while it isn't the point, it's part. So to me, that was important. So don't cut any characters. There are some TV and movie adaptations of Sense and Sensibility that Margaret Dashwood doesn't exist. They write her out. She's the youngest sister. Yep, and she's the main character of my book.
I remember when I would listen to Sense and Sensibility, halfway through they mention her, and I had to Google the plot line. I think I went on Wikipedia and read through the basically the plot summary, and I had to be like, where? I don't remember her name even being said. And I think right at the start, in like an off comment, they mention another sister, but she has like, if I'm right, next to no speaking lines.
But she's always there.
Yeah.
She's just there in the background. And so I thought it would be fun to retell the story from her perspective. So she's the hero of our book, but everybody forgets about her all the time, as everybody does. So you just exactly nailed it. So I have to make sure I hit all the beats. So it was important to me that all the main characters were there. And in Mansfield Park, there's a lot of main characters. That Junior and her brother. In the book, it's Fanny and William. In this, it's Junior and Bill. They have to be there. They have to be really tight as siblings. So it's like, how do you make them as tight in the modern day as you do that? So I had them. She skips a grade. They're 2 years apart, but they're stuck together. I create this weird way that they actually live in their own house together, like at the back of their family property. So they have this weird relationship, because they're also the like nannies of the family. They're the oldest of 10 children. So they're like in charge of everything. So they're like brother and sister who are also like aunt and uncle to their own siblings who are also like nannies to their parents, and they just got shit to do, right? So like I need to find a way to connect them. I need to make sure that all the other characters are there and that their personalities are very similar. I don't want to change their personalities. So like Fanny Price is good. The problem with the Mansfield Park TV adaptations or movie adaptations, there's only been a couple that I've seen, and neither of them I think are very good because they go out of their way because they're like, Fanny Price is super boring. We got to give her something clever to say. I'm like, no, you don't. So I make her very self-depreciating. Like there's one time where she tries to do something sarcastic and then she feels terrible and guilt-ridden for saying it. And then she has like this whole like anxiety attack in front of somebody. She's like, I didn't mean, I'm so sorry. Like to just keep their personalities the same. So like in that book, Edmund is his name. So I call him Ed. He's still like in the original book, he ends up being a minister. So he studies history and religion. He doesn't have to be a minister. Like Norris, the auntie from Mansfield Park, she's the wife of the minister. I just made her the minister just because I can cut that. Don't Mr. Norris. I don't need him. He's actually dead the whole book. So you don't need him. So I just cut him. Why have him? So like, if you're going to cut somebody, they're not essential to the plot. But like, even in Mansfield Park, the oldest son, Tom, his best friend is called Yates, John Yates. He just goes by Yates, his last name. And he's around. And they're actors and they do all this fun artsy stuff together. And so I've always thought they were a couple, but that wasn't allowed. So I was like, I'm just going to make them a couple. So in my book, they're a couple, but they're still both there. So like, while you can change the ages and Sense and Sensibility, I've obviously made Brandon their age. And he's not a colonel. His mom is.
Right.
So I just was like, his mom's a pilot in the Royal Air Force and he's not. But he wants to be a vet. So he's still a vet. So because he's a veteran, Colonel Brandon's not active duty anymore in Sense and Sensibility. So I just acknowledge that, but I give them their same personalities. So that's the number one key is don't change them. And that's why Clueless works so much is because Cher and Emma have the same exact personality. Mm-hmm. And George and Paul Rudd.
He can just be Paul Rudd. It's fine.
Okay, George and Paul Rudd have the same personalities, right? They have this. They have this affinity for Emma, for Cher. They're the older brother, but they're not really by blood. But they seem like a brotherly figure. They're a little bit older. They're a lot wiser. They chastise her sometimes, but it's only because they see her potential. All that stuff is all there. So like the reason that works is because their personalities. You keep those. So I made sure I did that. And then the rest of the story, I kind of let it write itself. I talk to my characters, and so I kind of let them take over. But as long as I know who they're going to be, and so before I start writing, I read it again, I take notes, I think about them, I talk to them, but I know who they already are. And I think if you're going to do an adaptation and you're going to change the personality traits, that's a problem. Even in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, the characters still have the same personality, and that's the most important thing. Like, Lizzie Bennet and Darcy are still Lizzie Bennet and Darcy. They just kill zombies.
Well, yeah, it's almost like the way I loosely interpret this is almost like reincarnation in a way, where it's like the core values of the person is the same. It's just elements of the environment are different, but the story beats are continuing. History is bound to repeat itself. So you've almost got this thing where it's like, this is almost like, they are the same characters in air quotes, but also you could almost argue, you could read the Jane Austen novels and then yours, and they're almost reincarnated versions. Like, I like thinking when you mentioned when you got the book deal and when you were talking about, Jane Austen, and I know is Austenite, is that the name of someone who's
Austen? Yeah.
Austenite? Yeah, cool. So I was like, I know you're such
Janeite. It's a Janeite.
Janeite. I prefer Austenite, but
Janeite there was a short story written called Janeites.
Oh, okay.
And it's about Jane Austen fans. It's an old story. So Janeite is the term. Yeah.
Maybe Austenites are people who really like the Austin Powers movies. I don't know.
That'd be fine too. And
I don't like those movies very much. So for me, it'd be very different. But in any case, the Janeite Austenites, with the people who enjoy Jane Austen, when you first told me about it, one of the things I was most excited for was because I know you're so passionate about Jane Austen. I was like, I want to get more into it. It's because of you that I end up listening to the Sense and Sensibility
that makes me so happy
audiobook. And so I will eventually, and that's why we went to the Jane Austen house, because we're like, well, Tony loves her so much. We want to go there and get him a little souvenir, but also I want to learn more about Jane Austen. And because she's like the ultimate underground, but not underground figure. It's one of those weird things where everyone loosely knows who Jane Austen is. Everyone's heard of Pride and Prejudice, and then a lot of people have heard of Sense and Sensibility, and then Emma. But as you say, her other 3 novels, a lot of people haven't heard of and almost certainly haven't read. And for someone who's so important in history, but isn't always said in the same breath as people like Shakespeare and elements like that. I know she's not quite as influential as Shakespeare, few are, but when you said you got this book deal, my first thing was I was so excited for you because you will get a whole new generation of people, not just young people, like as in people like myself, into Jane Austen via your novels. And so with that, like, has Lee, I assume Lee's read and assisted, has she, like, when you were bouncing ideas off her, because she was such, the reason I asked if it was Janeite, Austenite, whatever, was because I was going to refer to Lee as an Austenite or a Janeite. Because you're
Janeite too,
because you're both such big Janeites, like, what, did you have to at some point be like, I feel like this character will do this thing. Lee, does that sound right to you as well? Like, were you bouncing things off Lee as well?
Oh, yeah, we talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talk all the time. So she's always the first reader, of course, but she also listens to it. So, like, with this book, she read it as I was writing it. She's such a good editor. Like, part of her problem is she can't, like, 'cause the first draft is always a mess. There's typos and shit in there. So she always wants to noodle, which is good for me because I need those. You know, we're all our own worst editors. We all miss our own typos and stuff. So she would do that and then not really think too much about the plot. And she did that with The Will too. She was reading it as it came along. But I always, everything I write, I'm always talking to her about it. And so, yeah, we talk through the characters, or I'll say like, oh, here's what I think I'm going to do. Like, there's a character called Lucy Steele, who's kind of a dum-dum from Sense and Sensibility. And I feel like my heart breaks for her because she doesn't know that she's a dum-dum, and that is too bad. And that's in both, like, so I need to make sure she's a dummy, but I also don't want to be mean about it. But some people are going to be mean to her, and we have to address that because that's how people are. When there's people who are just walking dumb and they're totally like clueless. Their hearts are good, but they say, you know, we all know that person who doesn't genuinely unaware. Not a bad person, but just really dumb. Like, man, I don't know how you're going to function in the world. So that's Lucy Steele. So as I was creating her, I was trying to figure out, like, what's my way in this modern setting. So I was thinking around and I was kind of writing around it, getting for her to be there. And finally, I was like, okay, she's watched bad rom-coms. Not good rom-coms, bad rom-coms. Bad rom-coms where the girls have to play dumb and just say yes to the boys and do whatever and do all these things. So that's who she has created herself to be, because she's like totally Randy. She really wants a boy. And that is her whole thing. And I'm giving her that agency because I'm okay with that. Like, they're sexual beings. That's great. So she's like, what do I do to get a man? I just don't know. And she doesn't know. And their mom is gone. It's like they're being raised by their dad. And so he's like a math. And there's a whole conversation about math versus maths in my book too.
Oh, nice.
The Steeles are Americans. So when they come over and Maggie says, what does your dad do? And she says, oh, he's a professor. And she's like, oh, and what? And she says, math. She's like, we say maths here. And that, like, makes Lucy's brain fall out. She's like, and Maggie talks around it, and it's fine, and it's a fun scene, and I'm proud of it. But yeah, so then I realized that. So I said it to Lee one day at dinner. I'm like, I think this is what I'm going to do with Lucy, and this is how I'm going to do it. She's like, oh, that works. And so, but if she was like, so then I would, if she makes an face, then that means it is going to work. If it's not going to work on her, it's not going to work on anybody.
Well, yeah, exactly.
She's the toughest crowd. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's one of those, when you make an adaptation, you want to get the new generation and people who've never been near Austen before. But it's when you create your own new fiction with new characters and stuff, it's a clean canvas. But the challenge is getting people through the door. You know, you could be the greatest writer in the history of mankind, but if you've got no publisher and no way to get your book out, no one's going to read it. When you've got a connection, be it Star Wars, Jane Austen, or Shakespeare adaptation, shout out to your conversation with Spider Dan about the 5 Shakespeare. Great. Yeah. They were really fun to listen to. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Yeah. But obviously, when you've got a connection, it's a not quite a double-edged sword, but it's a catch-22 in certain ways, because you've got the jumping off point that if people search for Jane Austen on the internet, or people want to find more Jane Austen content and they will come across your stuff, it's like, cool, you'll probably have more people getting through the door than if you created your own original fiction. But at the same time, you've also got the baggage, you know, and that's, in my opinion, the worst things about Star Wars fans, is because they've got all this baggage of 40-ish years of content and they think they know what they want when they don't. But with Jane
Agreed.
Austen, it's like, yeah, they're the worst Star Wars fans, and everyone thinks.
And
they
we
know what
are
they
Star
want.
Wars fans. And my cousin and I were just talking about like the worst fans in the world, Star Wars fans.
100%.
My earliest memory, as I've told you, is seeing Star Wars with him. We were just talking about how did we come through it? Like, how come we're okay? How come we still love everything and we're not just big turds about it? I don't know, but it's true.
It's a tough one, but like how, like with it being an Austen thing, it's thing where, you know, kudos to you for being able to write this. And obviously it's a good, not only because I have faith in you as a writer, but obviously because it's being published, obviously it is good. But like that having to straddle the line of being original enough, that for new people is going to be exciting, but also not being disrespectful to the core content. And it's this odd balancing act. And one element of that I want to tackle and ask you about is the whole American English thing. Because obviously Jane Austen is British, or English, however one wants to put it. And obviously especially when I was listening, especially audio wise, when I was listening to Sense and Sensibility, and you've got this whole voice cast, and they're all very well spoken. You know, some people think
Emma Thompson.
Well, yeah,
queen.
exactly, and she is an absolute queen, and she's one of the very few substantially older women than me that I just fancy because she's just so amazing, and so just the way she speaks is just incredible. But like some people wrongly think that I'm well spoken, and I'm not a well spoken British individual. I'm moderate, if that. But when I listened to Sense and Sensibility, I was like, this makes me want to talk better. I was listening. I was like, this feels like a fantasy world. There are people who speak like that. In it's kind of like the Queen's English. You know, mainly rich people speak like that when they can. But it's the kind of thing. It's so English. So English, and especially because Austen's written, 200 years ago, the way she writes, language evolves and things. So how is it that, like, obviously where they all center around an American college, how is it that we've already spoken about translating it to loosely YA and making it in the modern times and keeping core values, but the biggest thing for me I was querying is from quintessential, like, pure Englishness to Americanness, and other characters that are from Jane Austen, are some of them English, some of them American. How did you do that balancing act? Because I know you asked myself and some of the other members of Comics Emotion and other people about English colloquialisms and things. Like, how did you do that?
So, again, I didn't know I was writing a whole series when I made Maggie Dashwood British, to be fair. I just wanted that. I just was like, that'll be fun. And so I set it in America because that's where I'm from. And so I was like, okay, who would the prices be? They'd be these people, and this is what they are, and this is where they live. They live in a town called Unincorporated Nowhere. And that's where they're from. They're like these Southern folk. And they've got a very specific thing about them. And so I wanted Junior to be like a poor Southern girl, so that when she goes up to this rich Northern school, she's going to be more of a sore thumb. Because you and I have discussed that North and South is flipped in England.
Yeah.
That's from the United States. But it's the same idea. Region matters. Like, we're awful. People are so judgmental. So I just decided to set it in America because that's what I knew. And then once I realized, oh, shit, I sold the whole story. Now I got to decide where everybody's from. So I did, because Maggie was in the book from England, I couldn't unring that bell. I had time. It was like, it'll be funsies. So I wanted one character to really, truly lean into that. Now, I'm an American, so the narration is written in American English. When Maggie speaks, she speaks in British English. She says mum, and she says, A&E instead of emergency room. She says the things. So I'm learning all this stuff. Like, you guys say, I'm in 5th form or whatever, and we say like 7th grade or whatever. So like, I'm learning. Jack sent me like a whole list, because he teaches that. So he's like, here's the things. So when I ask different people different stuff, because, when I need a question about university, I ask Megan, because she's the person who I know who's been there the most recently. And so it's like, I need to know about one of the, like, my version of Marianne Dashwood is going to study drama. So I was like, Spider-Dan, tell me all the words. And he's like, these are the words. And so then the words that are in the book are the words Spider-Dan said, this is how we say we're studying drama. So I was like, okay, cool. So that was it. So it's like, ask people, look things up. The internet exists. So I ask. But I prefer to ask you guys first. I've got a few links to a few key resources for like how like local government works over there, because that matters. Because
you asked me before, and I was like, I only just know the basics.
Right. But it was enough to get by. So those things really matter. And so like the problem is too, because I set the letter from the first book, the opening of the first book, you see that Maggie's invitation for the Mansfield gift goes to goes to Exeter. So it's like, all right, well, I got to set this somewhere near Exeter, but I don't want like Barton Park, which is where most of the book takes place, isn't real. So I make like small town out near Exeter, and so then I can just get to Exeter. So it's like when I need to get there, I can get there. So like Eleanor goes to college there, and Edward gets his graduate degree there, and like, you know, it's just easy enough to just have people be there, and then we're barely there. I don't have to know much about it because you're not there. You're really at this fictional place. So all of that to say, that's how that is. So the only character who's going to be from England is Maggie, and obviously her whole family. But I've even added some Americans to that because I think I need to get Maggie to America somehow. She's got to know some Americans for her to find out about Mansfield College. Like most small colleges in the middle of nowhere aren't going to be like, they're not going to come up on an internet search. She's got to meet somebody. Right. So I did that. And then what I do to make it like a Janey thing, one thing Jane Austen does is she is, as Jack calls it, I have an avuncular narrator. And avuncular means like an uncle, like who's like fun and talking directly to you. So I've called my narrator the cheeky narrator who speaks directly to the audience. Jane Austen does it all the time. She's less obvious, but there'll be parts of the book you're reading and you're like, oh, this is her talking to me, and these long, snarky sentences. So I did that. And by breaking that fourth wall and writing, and sometimes I'll say countenance, and sometimes I'll just throw some Austen-y, old-timey words in there in my narration, that helps. Lots of Jane Austen books, it's light on dialogue, long on commentary. So I made sure I did that. That's a very thick, plotting British novel thing to do. I mean, my book's almost 100,000 words. Mansfield Park's like 165,000 words. Wow. So I cut a lot, but I still needed to be like, how do I get those things? So to keep it British, I tried to mimic her style, but while writing in American English still, because that was very like my editor, Jen, she was like, we're not doing that. She just said, no, we're not going to have you write in different. That's not happening. There's a young adult writer called Justine Labalestier. She is from Australia. And one of her books, it's called the Magic or Madness series. Part of it takes place in Sydney and part of it takes place in New York. When you're in New York, it's written in American English. And when you're in Sydney, it's in Australian English. Everything, wow. The narration, the speaking, it is the most amazing thing. And I was like, it can be done. And Lee was like, but you're not Justine. You don't have her name. They're not going to let you do that. And it was a good call. And then my editor was like, no, you're not doing that. So they are allowing me to have the people speak in their accents and do those things. So I just wanted to capture her tone and her pacing. And it's thick. Like there'll be 2 pages without any dialogue, but there'll still be lots of commentary. I'll talk about, like you said, talk about the cursing or talk about a look somebody gave. So that's what I tried to do. What Jane doesn't do a lot of describing of people. She describes people's personalities. So the reason my cover looks the way that it looks is that all of them will look like this. Hopefully Jen Kostick, who did this, will do my cover, all 6 covers. It's amazing. Is that I want anyone to look at it and say, I could be the main character. Like Jane Austen heroines are all white girls because they were. In the books, but they're not
years ago in England. Yeah, it's like
right. They weren't described that way, but that's how they're always played, except for like Bride and Prejudice when it takes place in a different country. That, of course, like that. But I'm deliberately, the race of any of the 6 heroines is never going to be discussed. Now, the race of some other characters, like Colonel Brandon, is African American. Well, he's African Canadian and African. You guys don't say that. You guys just say black. We're the weirdos who do that, who say African American. You guys don't.
Americans are quite obsessed with, the 23andMe, like where your heritage is. Generally, Americans are over here. So where are you from? Like, what's your heritage? Like, none of us. I mean, England is just an amalgamation of just.
We don't give a shit.
We rummage through the crumbs of like a language is rummaging through the pockets of other countries and other nations and just shoving it into our weird sandwich of language. Like same with our entire culture. It's like, we were taken over by the Saxons and Vikings and then the Romans and then this and then that. So we're just like, where are you from? Whereas Americans are quite specific about it, which is
and so Right. It's so anyway. So Brandon, my Brandon, his dad's Canadian, his mom's British, but he's black. It's very clear that he is. You don't know what color what race the Dashwoods are. You don't know what race the Prices are. I'm going to be very specifically vague about that on purpose because I want anybody can read it, male, female, non-binary, doesn't matter, that you could be the heroine of this. So I also am deliberate about that. Like, I didn't want the cover to be like another white girl. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to be a girl going somewhere. Do you know what I mean? Like a person. So that was important to me too, because I think Jane would like that. I think there's a lot of things. My whole thing is I want to make Lee proud and I want to make Jane proud. And that's what I want to do with these. Like, I think Jane Austen would love Emma. Would love Clueless. I think she would think that is amazing. So that's kind of it too, is that, so I can never write like her. I'm trying to write like her. You know what I mean? Like, I can't be her. I can't write in, that, early 19th century British English, but I can write with that tone. So that's what I'm trying.
You wouldn't, because if you wrote like Jane did back then, it wouldn't really be an adaptation. It would be just you writing her stuff.
And part of the problem is you've acknowledged it. You're no dummy. Jess acknowledged it. Jess Davies. You guys read books. You guys are thinkers. But the language, it is inaccessible at times.
Yeah.
I would always recommend everybody tries to start with Emma or Pride and Prejudice, which I get, but you should actually start with Northanger Abbey.
Right.
Because it's shorter. It's more direct, and you get into the rhythm. Or do what you did and listen to an audiobook first.
That really helps.
Especially with the full... It really does,
because that. Yeah.
The really language is different. It's the same thing with Shakespeare. It's the same thing with anything. And it doesn't matter. Even Gatsby, like I'm teaching Great Gatsby in a class, and I'm teaching Kate Chopin's The Awakening in a class. And students struggle with, and those are American, written in the last, 100, 150 years. And people are still like, that's just hard to get through. Mm-hmm. And it's like, right, but they're like, this book takes place in New Orleans. You're in Michigan. You should be able to handle it. And they're like, And it's because just language evolves. It never stops evolving. So I do use lots of modern language, but I still write it in a kind of older sensibility. And it's just trying to honor the thing without being the thing. Right. Because, like, it's not a remake. It is an adaptation. My editor, Jen, said, lots of Jens involved in this book, but my editor, Jen, said, she's like, it's an Austen, but it's not like to me, this is a love letter. This whole series is a love letter to her. I'm going to keep the beats the same. I'm going to keep the character traits the same. I'm going to tell the story, especially since the middle 4 books are not the main character of the book, of the Austen book, isn't the main character of my book. Right? This only Mansfield and Northanger is the main character of the original book going to be the main character. But they're all in there. Like, and so I'll be like, in Sense and Sensibility, I have to stop midway and be like, well, we need to know what's going on, because while it's Maggie's story, this affects her because these are her sisters. So we're going to talk about this for a second. And I just say that as the narrator, like, we'll come back. Don't worry, dear reader. And I call the reader, dear reader, capital D, capital R, like right at you, saying, don't worry, it's okay. And I try to make it vague, like when it is. I don't put any dates. It's now. Instagram exists. The internet exists. They drive a Range Rover. Like, the music is the music. The music is really important to me. And so obviously I write soundtrack. Like, I have music that I listen to. Junior in Welcome to Mansfield loves classic rock. It's the only real connection she has with her dad. So you think that's the whole thing. She and her dad have a bad relationship, but she loves his music. So there's classic rock. So there's this young 16-year-old, like, petite little girl. She's a girl. I'm very clear at the beginning. She's 16. She's still a girl. And she loves Van Halen. She loves the band Tesla. She loves Joan Jett. Like, she loves classic rock. Mm-hmm. Because she does. So those songs, I listened to those songs while I wrote the book.
Yeah, because it's one of those I was thinking back to something you said slightly earlier with the characters and lack of describing them, which that's one of the main ways that Star Wars is different from a lot of other literature, because with Star Wars, it's all about detail and lore. And if a character's a certain species, they kind of, if a Wookiee is a Wookiee.
Gotta say.
Do you know what I mean? You could be a short Wookiee, or your fur can be a different color, but a Wookiee is a Wookiee, and that's kind of how you differentiate. But with a lot of the other books that I have read, or audiobooks I've been listening to and things, I do like it a lot when it's probably one of the things that causes the most amount of friction with film adaptations just from the start is that's not how I envisioned them in my mind, but it never is, because however the director or maybe even the concept artist or
casting director
collaboration, well, yeah, even that it's or makeup artist, depending on if it's if it's sci-fi, fantasy, whatever, and it's one of those where I think you have to capture the essence of a person. You don't need to describe this unless it's relevant to the story. This person has blue eyes or brown hair or whatever, but if it's like when they walk, they slouch. They hold themselves high, they hold their chin high, they talk with their mouth open, they slur a little bit when they're drunk. Like, there's little key elements, I think, that a lot of people, I think with being a writer and being an author, because linking in as well with what you said, you speak to your characters, a lot of, over the time of doing this podcast, a lot of the authors, they think they're mad by saying they talk to their characters, but I think I've had more authors confess they talk to their characters than don't, and I think the ones that don't probably do, but they just didn't say it on the show.
They do.
But you have to. It's kind of that thing of how do you connect? How do you get into the mind of a character, whether or not you've created them or you're doing an adaptation? You still have to. You have to know what they would do in a certain situation, and therefore you have to put yourself. You have to be empathetic and things. And I think a lot of that is learning and putting into words what your subconscious already processes. Like, it's one of those things which, when people say, don't be judgmental of people, generally try not to be a judgy dick, but what people, when they say that kind of thing, my mind immediately goes to pessimistically is like, okay, but if someone's walking towards you in the street, it's dark, it's nighttime, you're by yourself, and they are looking at you in a certain way and walking in a certain way, you will consciously or subconsciously think, maybe I'm in danger now. I don't know, depending on, not necessarily I'm talking about race or anything like that. I'm just saying, like, if someone has a certain body language when they're coming towards you, if your partner or friend is in a bad mood before they tell you. You get a vibe, you get that. And you really have to be able to look into what your subconscious is processing, like consciously. You have to kind of bring it to the front of something that your brain has already kind of half figured out. You have to be able to do that. And I think with what you're describing is for certain characters, like, yeah, I'm not going to describe this person in how they look, but you have to do how they carry themselves. And then your brain will just fill in the gaps. And that's one of the beauties of reading. And that's one of the things I actually like a lot more about reading a lot of these books than the comics, because I love, obviously, comics as well. But when you read, I feel a lot more immersed in a book than in a comic, even though you'd think the opposite, because a comic, you get so much more information and you can just look at a scene and, oh, that looks amazing, cool, the ship's flying around, blah. But in your mind, the author's job is to take you on a journey, but to give you enough information so you follow the plot, but not too much information so that you can fill in the gaps. Because that's one of the issues with Tolkien is, like, the Lord of the Rings books, my dad always used to say he was a massive, massive reader. He's in fact written 2 books that are erotic crime thrillers. It's one of those. And he was said, the only films he thinks were better than the books was Lord of the Rings, not because the books are bad, but he's like, because of when Tolkien was writing in the 20s, 30s, he was like, before media was such a big thing, you've got 2 pages or 3 pages describing what a cliff looks like. And in the time, that was fine. But nowadays, it's slightly harder to read those kind of things in certain respects, because now that we've absorbed so much of the content, and we can fill in those gaps. So I think that's the tricky thing, is when you write, especially an adaptation where a lot of people who are Janeites have already got this understanding of what they think the characters are. You have to guide them without telling them, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I agree. And again, right, if you're a Janeite, you know how Fanny's going to be. You know how the villains of the piece are going to be. Now, I'm going to probably make some people mad, because, like I said, I've taken what I think are the key personality traits, and so some people I've made like more villainous than they probably you think they are. You listener, you reader think they are. I think Marianne Dashwood is an asshole, so I've made her one. Like, I think she's the worst. She's indecisive. She's a fool. She does dumb things. Or the oldest She's sister? The young one. She's the middle one. She's the one.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. I was thinking of the bottom.
Yeah. She's the Kate Winslet played her in the Emma Thompson movie, and she's great, by the way. What a great performance. I mean, Kate Winslet. I mean, come on. But like I think she was like, yeah, she's kind of a dick, and I'm going to play her that way. And I think that, and Emma is a jerk. Like Emma's rude. So when I get to that book, like it's from Jane's perspective, and Jane's like, Emma, what's your problem with me? Like, because Emma's obsessed with Jane Fairfax. She's like, Jane Fairfax, Jane Fairfax. And Jane doesn't even really know she exists. And so I'm going to write my version of Emma from that perspective of like everything's coming at her, and she's like, what is going on? So, but I'm not like making them terrible people, but I'm just making them be, so it is true. So you're trying to guide them that way, but there's still going to be certain things like Marianne is very vain. So you always know by just saying Marianne is vain, that tells you how she's not going to leave the house unless XYZ is already done.
Yeah,
right?
Hair being done, or the insinuation of makeup, those kind of insinuations. But you as a reader can decide what level of those
what the
insinuations.
level. Exactly. Right. Yeah. And so like Norris in Mansfield Park, and Mrs. Norris is the kind of villain. There's two villains in Mansfield Park, Lady Norris and Mary Crawford. And Mary and Hank Crawford. And I made them twins. They're not twins in the original one, but I'm like, I need them to both be here at the same time. So they're going to be twins. And that's going to be that. We're going to be done. And again, you can at me about that. Again, I've made Colonel Brandon age appropriate because he's still going to end up with Marianne at the end. And I don't want her at 6 because she's going to be a little bit older as time goes on. I don't want a 19-year-old with a 40-year-old. I'm not writing that book. I'm just not going to do it. So he can be 22 and I'll be fine with that, So that's a fine age difference. I'm here for that. So anyway, so like I've done those little things, but like Norris does mean hurtful things in Mansfield Park. So I've made her very severe, and I describe her in a severe way, and the way she sits and the way she moves. And I do say she has straight black hair. Don't say if it's a wig. I don't say if it's dyed. I don't say if it's all is she has straight black hair. That's her only. And she's very she's rail thin, and she's rigid, and she's angry. And so then what does her face look like? She's probably always scowling and whatever.
Like a crow. Immediately I'm like bird-like, like crow kind of. This is my own interpretation. Immediately I just went, okay, a bird, the sort of thing.
Yeah, and she is picky. She definitely does that. So so it's like I agree. That's my whole thing is just make it accessible. And I feel like there's so many people that I know who, when they find out I love Jane Austen, they're like, okay, and I won't shut the fuck up about it. And so they're like, okay, I'll try. And then they can't. And they're like, oh my God, that's impenetrable. So my hope is, too, if you read Welcome to Mansfield, and then you read that other Dashwood Girl, and you read the Austen Chronicles, then if you've never read them, you could go and read it and be like, okay, now I get what I'm looking for. I get an essence of this, and I can do it. And I'm not like a Classics Illustrated type thing, but like that. Like when I was a kid, you could read the Classic Illustrated comics, and those helped you. Or there'd be like abridged versions of Moby Dick without all the nonsense about the whiteness of the whale because you're 6 and you don't care. But reading that, and even when you're 30 and you read that, you're like, I don't care. Still, Jesus. Yeah. And Melville's quite the writer, but boy. And Faulkner, the same thing. So it's like the idea being, I can tell this story. I think the original writing is brilliant. I think it's all 5-star writing. I think everybody should read it. But I also know our brains have evolved. Like you said, you described it perfectly with Tolkien. I love Tolkien. I reread the Lord of the Rings series like 2 winters ago. I just read War and Peace this winter break. That's dense. There's a lot going on in there. That could have been cut down. That is like a young adult novel, by the way. There's a young adult novel in War and Peace, believe it or not. But we also have to have like 500 pages describing Napoleon's bad attitude. And I'm like, okay, I guess we need that. Like Napoleon's a character in this book, and he's kind of a turd. So, but I also get why people don't want to read it. It's daunting. You're like, clunk, 1,200 pages. That seems like I don't want to read that. And I get it. But to me, so if you can get through this and you like it, and you're like, oh, that's interesting, then maybe you'll give Mansfield Park a second look. Or people who are Janeites, people who do, they don't even have to be Janeites, but they're just like Jane Austen. They're like, yeah, that's fine. Or they've only read the big 3 and they're like, I've always heard Mansfield Park, whatever. Or I saw the Jane Austen book club or read Jane Austen book club because it's a book and a movie, and they make fun of Fanny Price. So I don't care. And I get it. But at the same time, so my hope is that people will do this and just, that's all it is for me, is like, I'm writing love letters to things I love. I teach literature and I teach this stuff. It's part of my life too. And I always have said there's just a handful of stories and we're all just retelling them.
Yeah.
Right? This is just family conflict. All of Jane Austen's stories are about class and family. You're in the wrong class. You love somebody who's above your station or below your station. You're friends with somebody who's above your station or below your station. And you're either rich or you're poor, or you're smart or you're dumb or whatever, or you just are an outcast. All of her books are about outcasts in one way or the other. And we're all those things. And so these are stories that have been told a million times before her. Mark Twain notoriously didn't like Jane Austen. And my argument is he was jealous.
Well, I've heard that although Mark Twain was a great man in many respects, he was also a massive dick. So it's one of those
huge misogynist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can read it in his, I mean, Becky doesn't have a ton to do. Right. I mean, it's like he didn't know what to do there. But he notoriously didn't like her. And he's part of the reason why people think she's just romantic drivel. And they lumped her in with the Bronte sisters didn't really love her either because she was better than them.
Was that Little Women or Wuthering Heights?
No, well, Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, Agnes Grey.
I always get it's because of the Janes, and I'm not very literary, so I'm just like, what did I learn in English in school?
Right. Well, there's 3 Bronte sisters, and Anne Bronte, who I think is the most talented of the 3. Her books, Tenant of Wildfell Hall and Agnes Grey, almost no one's read. And I, again, blind spot, didn't read them until adulthood, and then I read them, and I'm like, ooh, drop the mic. Charlotte wrote Jane Eyre and Emily wrote Wuthering Heights. And I love Wuthering Heights. And Rhea's listening to this going, I hate Wuthering Heights. So she's shouting about how much she hates Wuthering Heights. Lee hates Wuthering Heights. Most people hate Wuthering Heights. I love that book so much. But Anne Bronte is a way better writer than either of her sisters. But again, it's the same thing. We focus on the torrid, romance stuff there. And again, that's part of it. But those books aren't about that. They're, again, about class and they're about being an outcast, and they're about being true to who you are and loving who you love or hating who you are, whatever. All those things are there. And it's just that in Wuthering Heights, they're just so mean to each other. The Brontes were all about mean. Everybody was mean. And it's funny, their dad was a preacher. Jane's dad was a preacher. There's a weird thing going on there. All these preachers' daughters have got stuff to say about life, apparently. They're just sitting there observing everybody coming through like hypocrite, full of shit. I'm going to write about it. So, it just, so for me, it's just trying to make it accessible, trying to make it fun. But owning that, even my other novel is like Faulkner-esque. Like when I was trying to describe it to somebody and she didn't get what was happening, I was like, did you ever read this? She's like, yeah. I'm like, it's just like that then. That's what it is. It's a modern day retelling of that. She's like, oh, okay. And it is, but it isn't, and it's like, so there's just only so many stories. We're just all retelling them. Even Shakespeare was retelling stories that happened before him. The Bible is retelling stories that happened before it.
Oh yeah.
And it's like parables. And again, whether you believe, I'm not here to say that, the Bible's full of fiction. What I'm saying is those are retelling of stories. Like those myths exist and the things that people believe in the gods that we believe in are stories. We're trying to tell ourselves stories, and story matters. Story gets us through it. It helps us explain things, helps us feel comfort. When you read, your empathy level goes up.
Mm-hmm.
Because you get to meet people that aren't you.
Yeah, and you have to have even a slim amount of empathy to be able to even read a book. So everyone, I think, is probably capable of a degree of empathy. It just depends if it's a slither or if it's a bathtub full of it. I don't know what the metric of empathy is. I don't understand what a metric of a suitcase full of empathy.
I like a bathtub of empathy. Yeah,
but yeah, it's one of those like my English. We'll start to wrap up, but my English teacher, English literature teacher, he specifically said he was like I think he said the general rule of thumb is it was either 6, 8, or 12. He was like basically. Every single story ever written, I think it was 8, will fit into one of these categories of, there's the tragedy. He said Shakespeare covered most of them, but he didn't create them. But you can always use Shakespeare as a template that almost every story can, in some degree, because Romeo and Juliet is a romantic tragedy, you've got, I'm not going to go through them, but there's comedies and etc. But it's like, they are retelling, and the thing is with stories as well, and literature even, and as you said, the Bible and even any religious writing, is that language develops before written language did. So before even anything could have been written down, even when we were like hunter-gatherers, or even before that, when we were like barely having language, there's stories that are told. Even like, to going really kind of far out. It's like animals warn, like crows will talk to other crows and say, hey, that dude down there's really cool. You give a crow like a nice shiny thing, they'll tell their other crow friends, and the other crows will come to you. That's the 100%. Crows telling a story to each other. It's just, it's that kind of thing. So all animals can, in a micro level, tell stories to each other. So us as humans and our predecessors of evolution have been able to communicate in that way. And stories have historically been told, first off, so for survival, avoid the red berries, they're poisonous, kids don't listen. Let's tell the kids a story about a kid who ate a red berry and then exploded or peed until he died. Random things. And that's stories, parables, proverbs, all of language. The foundation of it came from survival, and even a lot of religion, heaven and hell, good and evil, those kind of concepts is just, hey, don't do this thing. Okay, because of, here's a reason I'm going to give why you shouldn't do this thing, but the core value is normally to protect yourself or your clan. Don't go over there, don't scream at nighttime because the monsters will get you. Well, when we were told that, the monsters were like bears, so it's like, that's a good thing, but they've translated across time. So it's exactly what you're saying. It's just, language has evolved, and that's become into writing, and then that's evolved. So it's just adaptation after adaptation. But this one is a very exciting adaptation. This is one that I'm very excited to get into. I've already pre-ordered it, and I'll put a pre-order link in the show notes as well.
Well, when's this coming out, Michael?
Okay, it's the end of May, isn't it?
The book comes out on May 29th.
I thought it was 29th, but I didn't want to say it in case I was wrong and it'd be feeding misinformation. But in the show notes, I'll make that as well. And I'll put a link to your website and everything like that. But is there anything else as we wrap up that you wanted to say? The last thing you said was a perfect wrap up, to be honest with you. And I wish I'd kind of stopped it there without rambling on about crows.
You can edit, whatever. I like
I'm
the
not going to do that.
Okay. I would say, listen, I just say this. I just want people to give books a chance. And this is eventually and if you're like, ooh, I don't want to spend the money, I don't want to whatever, I get it. There's ebooks available. Eventually this will be available through Hoopla Digital and through Overdrive and Libby and whatever. My publisher's really good about getting into libraries, which is really important to me. So if you want to wait, that's fine. Our friend Ada McCartney is going to do the audiobook. So if you're like, I don't want to read it still 100,000 words, you said, it's fine. I just think whether it's this or whatever, I just think books matter, writing matters. I've been working my butt off on the new book and I feel so good doing it. And so thanks for letting me geek out and talk about it. It means a lot to me that you're doing this for me. And it's hard for me. It's easy. You're my first one doing this. So I was like, okay, I'll do it with Mike and then I'll be okay. And then Kyle wants to do one and Seth wants to do one. So that's good. People I know first, and then I'll go on other shows, maybe with people I don't know, and you're trying to hook me up with a friend of yours. So I just want to appreciate you, Mike, for being one of my biggest cheerleaders. That means a lot to me. And Mike, everybody, is going to be one of the first readers of the next book to tell me all the British stuff I got wrong. So I appreciate that. Or I got right, whatever. You're going to, you and Megan and Spider Dan and Rhea and Jack and Paul. So I appreciate it.
It's perfectly timed. It's perfectly timed because, I'm catching up my reading. I'm like, I've only got a couple more High Republic books to do. And then I've got a nice gap. And it was like with this, not that everything revolves around me, but in this scenario,
it does
works very well. It works very well for me.
Because I'm asking you to do a favor. So I appreciate that. So this is just, thanks for doing this. I mean, this is surreal to me. I don't physically have it in my hand, but I've read the arc. I can see the order link. I know people have bought copies. I know people have. 12-year-old me doesn't know what to do right now. I'm struggling with that a little. It's, imposter syndrome is a thing because you do this. You sit in your room alone and you tell a story, and then you have the balls to share it with the world, and you think they care.
It's very vulnerable.
So it's hard because I know I'm going to get bad reviews. I know people are going to hate it. There's somebody, when I was talking to Matt Kint the other day, he told me, one of my writing heroes, he's like, hey man, when you get your book, don't ever open it. Just put it on the shelf and be like, look what I did. He's like, cause you're going to open it and the first page you turn to, you're going to find a typo. He's like, you know what's in there. Don't do that. He's like, because typos happen, man. They get through the final edit. And it does. I mean, I've caught them in books. I'm sure you have too. You're reading a book.
I've literally got books behind me where there's typos. And I'm pretty good at spotting typos as well.
Yeah, me too. So. And I'm good, except my own. So it's just very exciting. And it's a very vulnerable thing to say, I think I'm good enough to be on your bookshelf. next
Well, I
to
know you are.
Claudia Gray. Well, thank you.
I know you are. And I wouldn't, I've spoken to a lot of authors, but with you, I wanted to make sure as much as I could. And I'm releasing this episode in one go. I'm not splitting this episode up at all.
Wow.
It's going to be one big go. I want people to hear you unfiltered without break. And it's just, your passion is inspiring. And your passion makes me want to get into Jane Austen more, and I want to shout from the rooftops about it. I've told some of my friends as well who are much bigger into reading than I am, and I'm going to push it as much as I can. So it's just your passion is infectious, and your love of Jane Austen is, and it's just, I've spoken before about the pull, or, that kind of, I don't necessarily believe in destiny and things, but there's certain things that people just gravitate toward, and they just kind of, you just get drawn to stuff. And I just know that you in writing, it's always been a thing. And so for someone who's so passionate and has this manifestation of all their work coming together, just makes me as a person so happy. So any way I can help that, I just want to. So I'm going to be shouting from the rooftops about your book. I'm going to be reading your book. I've got it pre-ordered. I've got it. It says it's going to be on its way when it is. And when it does, I'll be taking photos, putting on social media and sharing it all. And this will be coming out, I believe, because I'm speaking to a High Republic author in 2 days.
What?
But yeah, another one. I've got another one lined up.
Dude, you're checking off. That's so proud of you.
Trying my best.
It's amazing.
Yeah, so and even
so
one
good.
of those.
You're going to be now. It's going to be like, oh, did you get on the Burton show yet? They're all going to talk to each other. And
I hope so.
That's how it's going to be. You're that guy.
But it's
so
like
exciting.
Even like Kevin Scott, I subscribed to his newsletter. He talks about he still has imposter syndrome. He's like a New York Times best-selling author. He's at the helm of the High Republic architects. He's written Sherlock. He's written Doctor Who. He's written like amazing classic British stuff.
One of the greatest indie comics of the last 10 years.
Yeah, and Shadow Service and things.
Oh my God.
And it's just like he's done all this, and he still today in his newsletter says he feels imposter syndrome. So it's not just you, it's any kind of amazing creative, but it's just, I'm going to be releasing this Sunday, so people will have time before the book comes out.
Thank you.
When the book actually does come out, I'll do double sharing and things like that. So just thank you so much, Tony.
All
the information will be in the show notes. You are genuinely an inspiration, and I can't wait to call myself a Janeite from getting into your stuff.
You did to our house. You're Kipling. He's the one who coined the term, so you'll be in good company. So that'll be good.
Fantastic. Well, just thank you once again, Tony.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.